And the webinar is good? Hello, everybody. This works? Okay, excellent. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first day of week 2 at COP. For some of us who have been around for a while, you're actually looking quite spirited and fresh. For those who just landed not that long ago, and this is their first day at the COP venue, it's great to be here and had a bit of FOMO, I must say, over the last week while there's so much action happening. So I'm Katie Sullivan, Managing Director at IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association. We have the pleasure of partnering with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators and, of course, the Environmental Defense Fund to bring to you a really important, special, and timely discussion on U.S. subnational carbon pricing markets, where we are, where we're going, what kinds of innovation leadership are coming out of the U.S. at the state level right now. And I can tell you right now, there's a lot happening. As part of my job with IETA, it's to keep track of where things are, or I'm Canadian, where the puck's headed on all of these activities. So we also hope to make this as interactive as possible and to take questions from the audience. And also, one positive thing about COP circa 2021 is that we have a virtual audience this time. And so we actually have some folks in the audience who watch it now or at the recording. So I am joined by really quite an impressive, fantastic group of legislators who are leaders on climate and environmental, NGO leader, to take stock of what's happening across some of those key regions. And we are joined by Senator Carlyle from Washington State, to my left, who chairs the Senate Environment, Energy, Technology Committee and instrumental in passing some major climate bills in Washington State, including the Climate Commitment Act, which we'll dig into a little deeper in a moment. We have California Assembly Member Eduardo Garcia, who has been a stalwart champion on climate action, including with community engagement and environmental justice, and on the cap and trade system, including the first extension of the cap and trade system, which was desperately needed a few years ago, and also a member of the California Air Resources Board for a number of years now. So we're thrilled to have Assembly Member Garcia with us. We have Don Euer from Rhode Island, and Don, who has multiple jobs we were talking about earlier, is a very hard worker, a member of the Rhode Island Senate since 2017, lead sponsor of Rhode Island's Act on Climate bill, which was passed earlier this year, and has been playing a very important role on, well, RGGI and TCI, the Transport Climate Initiative. And then last but certainly not least, we have Katelyn, Roedner Sutter, who has been a very good friend and ally to IETA and a lot of members across the US. I don't know how we would have gotten through the last couple of years without you and our partnership across Washington State, across the Northeast, across California, and also a member of IMAC, which might not for the global audience mean much, but it's a great role, important role for the cap and trade oversight group and the market advisory committee in California. I'll stop talking now because we want to get into the stories of what's happening, the current state, and we'll start with Washington State. So over to you, Senator Carlyle.
Thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure to be here with our colleagues. And it's such an honor to be at COP and to talk about, a lot of people within the UN world talk about subnational as US states and other entities. We don't accept that term at all. We say supranational. Because the supranational action on the ground for decarbonization of electricity, transportation, all these sectors is happening at the state level. So I'm excited to talk about the Climate Commitment Act, our Cap and Invest program. We've renamed the old idea of sort of cap and trade. We think that it's really about investing in communities, and it's about decarbonizing those really challenging sectors that get us to 2050 science-based targets. You know, I think secondly, as we set the stage for this, I come from a district in Seattle. I have Amazon, the Gates Foundation, the fishing industry, the Port of Seattle. We're a robust international global city. We have maritime industry, the aviation industry, Amazon, Microsoft, Starbucks, Costco, Boeing, world-class companies and organizations. Virtually every one of these organizations has committed to science-based targets 2050. And we as a state have made that commitment. The Climate Commitment Act accounts for 53% of our anticipated emission reductions by 2030. So the fundamental point is that the future of carbon pricing is essential to be successful in Washington State, California, Quebec, eastern states around the country and around the world. We cannot decarbonize, we cannot be successful at an economy-wide level and a sector level without meaningful carbon pricing strategies. And that's why we're so successful and so happy to be at this stage. We have the great privilege of going second. California went 8 years ago. We have 8 years of learning with a sense of humility and grace from evidence-based best practices around the world, not just California. The help of the Environmental Defense Fund, all the best practices from California. We had that opportunity to learn those lessons, to craft this legislation. We're past it, and now we're moving forward. So I'm excited to really dig in and just appreciate all of our opportunity to talk about how important it is to move forward with carbon pricing worldwide.
Thank you so much. We actually last week partnered with the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition for a very high-level panel on carbon pricing that included prime ministers of Canada and Sweden, and you had the heads of the WTO and the IMF and the EU president, and the list goes on. We were just like, do we have enough space on stage? And California came up, frequently, as usual. You welcome newest kid on the block to Washington State. Happy to have you, but all the leadership that we've seen out of California and Quebec and WCI. So you've been in the trenches, Assemblymember Garcia. You've been in the trenches, and where are things standing right now in the world of carbon pricing, the cap and trade system?
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for the invitation and to allow California to play again a critical role in sharing, our story. And it's great to see other states like Washington follow, and congratulations to you, Senator, and your colleagues for really taking the leadership that you have. Now we get the opportunity. Aside from the extension that you mentioned to the program, we now are undertaking what we call the scoping plan review, and what are the regulatory mechanisms that we'll be using moving forward to achieve our 100% renewable energy goals, emission reductions. And at the front and center of these conversations are the environmental justice organizations, and how we put those communities that have been disproportionately impacted front and center of our priorities. Where are our investments being made to turn around those circumstances? So they're playing a critical role. Our environmental justice organizations and communities like the one that I represent in the most southern part of the state of California, a name that probably will resonate is a small little town by the name of Coachella, that has a small little event that takes place every year or so. And it's the communities like those that go all the way down to the Mexican border, where we see the need to ensure that our programs, and not just the cap and trade program, but all of our other mechanisms that we've established, the low carbon fuel standards, the adaptation programs that we have in place. How do we integrate our growers, our farmers? We have a large farming community throughout California, a $50 billion industry that we've got to bring along as well to help us meet these goals and objectives. So we're excited that we're moving into our next phase of that work, but we're also excited to see other states moving in this direction, because now we get to see what they're doing and look at what their best practices are going to be. So we're excited to be here to share, contribute, as well as take away some ideas that we can implement in California to improve our objectives and play a critical role at the global stage to fight climate change. And always remember that it's also about climate justice when we're talking about the environment.
Please be circling back around to that topic. It's really, really important. And there's actually a pocket of quite innovative things happening in the Northeast. And with, RGGI, and for a number of years, I've tracked RGGI, and, my members and partners are involved with RGGI. I always called RGGI the little engine that could keep on going, keep on trucking, and it's still there, and it's still stable, and it's weathered a lot of storms, including politically. So your involvement with Reggie, but also TCI, and maybe some of the more notable things, or where first of all, where things are, or maybe explain at a high level the TCI initiative, and then some of the more unique features for TCI, including with the EJ, the environmental justice link to it, would be great.
Sure, yeah. So as you mentioned, so Rhode Island, we were part of RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which really looks at the electricity production sector. And, you know, as we're talking about, you know, states like California, states like Washington State, and then we have Rhode Island, right? We're small but mighty. And so we have to really be creative and innovative to make sure that we're using our agility, our small stature is a strength. We're more agile, I think, than some other states, so we can do a lot more kind of test laboratory to see how things work, and really kind of push this conversation forward. So one of the things that I worked on this year in the General Assembly was passing our Act on Climate legislation, which updated our climate targets, and it also made sure that those were enforceable, and it also included environmental justice provisions, because as was said, we need to be thinking about climate justice, because there is no way to have climate justice without looking at environmental justice. And one of the things I find most exciting about some of these conversations and where they're at globally on a state level and on a local level is that people are talking about environmental justice who, you know, 10 years ago didn't even know that was a phrase that existed. So now they're talking about it, trying to understand it, and trying to figure out how to implement those principles into the law. So the Transportation Climate Initiative, it's really based on the principles of RGGI in a regional kind of cap and invest program that looks at the transportation sector. We are not going to hit our climate goals if we don't hit an economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction strategy. Transportation is a huge piece of that, and it makes sense for us to act regionally because, you know, cars don't just stay in Rhode Island. We're a very you know, transient community. We have folks who work in Massachusetts, work in Connecticut, live in Rhode Island, vice versa. So we really do need to address the transportation sector in a regional way. And so I think the TCI bill is really an innovative approach to look at, you know, and treat greenhouse gas emissions as the pollutant that they are. It treats them as the pollutant that they are, looks at that, and then also, again, with the environmental justice piece of it, talks about equity. The TCI model rule has a chapter on equity, talking about wanting to make sure that there's advisory boards that are made up of community members so that people who are impacted negatively by these pollutants have a seat at the table in crafting these policies. There's an investment commitment. So the money that's generated from these fees isn't just going into the pockets of the polluters, but it's being invested back into the communities that are being most harmed by the pollutants. And it also has an assessment period, a reporting and assessment period, so we can reflect back on what's working, what's not working, and make adjustments. So.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff going on in that, and I think when we saw the features with the environmental justice considerations and like the governance, right, and the procedural, there was something new that we hadn't really seen elsewhere, but it's getting a lot of attention, well beyond, you know, TCI. So Katelyn, you kind of like me are floating around a lot of things in the U.S. and beyond. And so, you know, carbon pricing kind of having a moment right now in the U.S.
Absolutely.
And beyond. Again, we're probably at around 70 carbon pricing, mandatory compliance carbon pricing systems globally. So that's even more than what the World Bank had featured earlier this year and what we call the gospel of carbon pricing. So we're having a bit of a moment. And where do you see things head? Are we going to have possible other jurisdictions that want to join the club? What's your thought?
Yeah, I think you're right that carbon pricing really is having a moment, and I think some of this is a reflection that, you know, we need to have binding limits on greenhouse gas pollution if we are going to meet targets, whether it's their economy-wide targets or sector targets, but we need those binding limits. And, you know, I think that's what's so exciting about TCI is, you know, transportation is such a huge contributor to greenhouse gas pollution along the East Coast, that having that binding limit I mentioned to pollution is really key to driving down those emissions. And all of the equity provisions that Senator Euer discussed in terms of investments and consultation. I mean, that's like the next frontier of carbon pricing. And I think we're really seeing some innovative pieces to make sure that we're addressing disproportionate impacts and cumulative impacts, and getting at some of those conventional air pollutants alongside greenhouse gas emissions. I think, you know, sticking on the East Coast for a minute, you know, we've also got the regional greenhouse gas initiative that you know, you also spoke about, and we're seeing that expanding, I mean, almost as we speak with Pennsylvania, you know, now moving towards joining RGGI, which is huge. I mean, that's a huge source of pollution in Pennsylvania. And so to have their electricity sector also under this binding limit on greenhouse gas pollution is incredibly significant. And there's very strong support from you know, residents in the state of Pennsylvania for this kind of mechanism. And I think it's because, you know, they recognize there's investments to be had in community, there's benefits for local air pollution, and of course the climate benefits. So, you know, we're seeing this movement on the East Coast of adding new jurisdictions. And then, you know, moving, I guess, to the middle of the country, Illinois just passed some really significant clean energy legislation that it doesn't include carbon pricing, but it does include, you know, a consideration of carbon pricing and the benefits that might provide in terms of, you know, achieving reductions in their energy sector, but also generating investments for that transition. So you know, maybe there's something on the horizon in the middle of the country. And then if we move over to the West Coast, of course, we have Washington that just passed the Climate Commitment Act under the leadership of Senator Carlyle. You know, we've had California as a leader there with Assemblymember Garcia for years. And I do think we have some other states across the West that are looking to, you know, the investments that California has been able to make, and then some of the innovations that Washington has made. And so I do think that there are some states taking a new look at the role of, you know, limits on greenhouse gas pollution, a price on carbon, and then also, you know, how it can be designed to make sure we're also getting at conventional pollutants and local air pollution and cumulative impacts as well. So yeah, that's, you know, quick fly over the country, but there's momentum in lots of places.
We've had half a day, 2 days to talk about this stuff, and then you have 2 minutes to be teed up to talk about the latest. But there is something different in the air. Again, for people who've been around this space, there's something a bit different, and it's not just in the US, it's globally right now, and even how globally they're watching the US. But before we talk about kind of that intersect with you being at COP and, you know, takeaways from here, I'd like to go back to Washington. I want to dig in a bit more to the Cap and Invest bill, kind of what makes it different. I also, and it probably would go to all of you, another thing that's different in the air is business, many businesses, many different stripes and sectors stepping up, publicly supporting, taking action, which that was a challenge. I know certainly on the West Coast for a while, but elsewhere. So maybe about also just the business level of engagement for the bill would be great.
Absolutely. Well, look, I think the symbolic representation politically in terms of relationships of what it took to get the votes on this bill, we had the endorsement of the Climate Commitment Act of the Black Lives Matter Alliance and British Petroleum. We had Microsoft, we had Puget Sound Energy, our state's largest investor-owned utility. We had the technology sector. We had sort of a wide range. We had the traditional opponents, agriculture community, the timber community, some of the older style industrials, as a general statement. So it was a political dynamic that was tough. But I have to say that in many ways it was the tribes. We have 29 federally recognized tribes in our state. The relationship with the tribes, a deeper conversation about investments in the communities, the areas of riparian and reforestation and fish passages, all kinds of conversations about the needs of the tribal community. That was incredibly helpful. The business community was split. and that's the difference. A couple of years ago, in the last 4 years, Washington State tried 2 public initiatives on a carbon tax. One was written by activists, did not have any institutional support, but it made the ballot, and it got crushed by the voters of Washington. The second one, 2 years later, was organized. It was supported by the environmental community, by labor, by communities of color, and a number of other advocates, and it also got crushed at the polls. The fundamental strategic shift that we did in Washington was to move from both economy-wide pricing conversation to sector-based conversation around 100% clean energy renewables, clean fuel standard. I think we should put on the table, as you suggested, that the issue of clean fuel standard is now British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. And so the markets have decided, the business community has decided. I think the same type of shift is coming relative to cap and invest. It's going to take time. There are dynamics that we all know. I think if we do this well, I think we can help our friends in Oregon to get there. Another issue of passing the bill is we made some improvements. We made some changes from a sense of grace and humility of learning the lessons of California, those 8 years of experience. One of the things that we did very differently was environmental justice. We embedded in an understanding criteria pollutants in the community level. So we're not just measuring GHCs. So if you've got a polluted area near a major highway, an industrial park, low-income community, community of color, you're not just measuring the GHCs of a manufacturing plant. You're measuring what's really happening for that community on the ground. That's been a dream of the environmental justice community for years, and we got it in this bill. Another thing we did different and learned from California, made a big change in the policy, and this affected the politics, is that we didn't make any exemption of any company, any industry, or any sector. It's an economy-wide, all emitters, 25,000 metric tons and over, are included. And having an economy-wide system, now we have allowances, but we have a deep sensitivity to the pricing dynamics associated with California. And I think we learned lessons of best practices with Environmental Defense Fund's help and many others around having a floor and a ceiling, belt and suspenders around too many allowances. We're very sensitive to this issue, and we've got to make sure that we figure out how to do that. One other sort of impactful change we made is sort of acknowledging with a sense of humility that the issue of offsets and the integrity of offsets has to be done right. Now, what that means fundamentally is they have to be inside the cap. So we are ensuring that we have 97% direct, 93% direct compliance. 7-8% relative to offsets are included in the aggregate cap. And that's been one of the challenges that California has had, and we learned from that. So those are some fundamental structural improvements that we were able to make in partnership with conversations with California and others. And I think that informed the politics on a very deep level.
And just for the sake of our audience and those watching, the timeline for just the rulemaking activities and when it goes live.
So we are neck deep in rulemaking right now. We invite people worldwide. We're looking for evidence-based best practices. We're looking for comments. So much of the conversation here at the Climate Summit is about the trading vehicles and the collection of the data and the accuracy and avoiding double counting. All of those issues are critical. We're very similar in size to Quebec, so our rulemaking process is very important to learn from them. So we will do the full rulemaking basically with an expectation of first quarter of 2023 to have allowances and auctions.
That's moving fast. That's ambitious. That's a lot of work to do, but that's great. So going to Assemblymember Garcia, I don't know if you have any quick reactions to what Senator Carlyle just told us about the work and how California is approaching, watching, but also thinking, but about the scoping plan for your backdrop that you're in the throes of it.
Well, I guess I'll start with the initial question as it relates to business, right? And what are they looking for? Consistency, predictability, right? Tell us what the rules are and we'll plug away. Our constituents and our communities that have been disproportionately impacted are also looking for that from our government. And we're in a unique position to lay out the groundwork as it relates to our investments and the regulatory standards and mechanisms that we can utilize to bring about what I refer to as co-benefits in these communities to create economic development opportunities as a result of these innovative technologies that are coming out of our regulations and our public policy. And I think of our region that is being looked at as the potential next innovative hub when it comes to addressing our transportation electrification needs. The identification of lithium at the Salton Sea that could potentially develop an entire supply chain, which is predicted to have 40% of global opportunity demand, that could create economic development circumstances in a region that has historically been economically depressed. Moving into the conversation about the scoping plan, what are the mechanisms? What are those regulatory rules that can lead us to addressing those economic shortcomings in places throughout the state? Why mention that? Because it's about democratizing our climate change policies in California and really turning around circumstances for people out there. So we're excited to see Washington move in the direction that they're going in, because we now will have someone or something to look at. Going first is always a great thing, but it's going first into an area that we have nothing really to set our standards or our benchmarks to. We now have partners that we can work with and regionalize our efforts and send those market signals to the business community, and at the same time develop a predictable and consistency in terms of what we're doing on the ground to address the environmental justice issues in our communities throughout the state.
Well, you're speaking my language around business and need for stability and confidence that everything, is going to be around, and not just in a year or two from now. It's 5 years, 10 years, what's going to happen. And hi, welcome. Where was I? Business stability. And I think one quick question actually I have for you, back at you. Yeah, just it's about the role of cap and trade. So you played a huge role in getting the extension to 2030. It's unknown though through 2030, or even just the role of cap and trade and like carbon neutrality goals and just going through the scoping plan process. So
Sure.
any other finer points just about that role of the market?
Look, we're looking at the issue of allowances. We're looking at the issue of what do we do there to make sure that pricing is where it needs to be in order to achieve the many goals and objectives and the investments back into the community. For us, it's extremely important that we're also not just depending solely on cap and trade. That was designed as a backstop and not necessarily the go-to end-all be-all mechanism. So we've got to ensure that our scoping plan is diverse and that it achieves a multitude of objectives, once again, to ensure that we bring along every sector and segment of the California population. For us, we will be watching very closely what's happening in Washington and supporting their efforts and hoping that there is something along the way that we can also build off of to make our Cap and Trade 2.0 program the most effective program that it can be in California.
Thank you. All right. So, and it's just, so scoping plan 2022, big year. You'll be having the draft later in the year. You'll do the rulemaking. You need a microphone. No, I'm saying. Oh, sorry. It's not a very good moderator right there. You're gonna mic. all I would say, Washington, big year, rulemaking activities galore, both LCFS, cap and invest. Then you have scoping plan, California 2022, probably not intentional, but kind of serendipitous, right? And then, so I want to dig into Act on Climate, the bill. Played a big role in that, and the role that you see Reggie TCI playing in the objectives of that bill, which is much broader, right, than Reggie or TCI.
Right. So, so our Act on Climate bill, it for the first time set a net zero target for Rhode Island for 2050. So, and we also have interim goals to get to that target. For me, I think Reggie and TCI, you know, they were talking, there's been talk about, you know, the sector-based transformation. So it's one thing to have goals, but you need a plan to get there. And how does that actually, how does the rubber meet the road? How do you actually make that transformation happen? And you have to influence the sectors that are causing the problem. Transportation, energy, buildings, you know, how do we address that, address those sectors? And so the TCI bill is really critical to make sure that we're actually being aggressive about addressing the transportation sector, and that we're also having those investments back as a feedback loop to address the inequities as well. So I think there isn't a way for us to actually hit our climate targets without these sector-specific programs and initiatives.
Maybe while you have the mic, and this is a question for all of you, including you, Katelyn. U.S. right now. So U.S. very much back at the table. Paris celebrations, yay! Things are moving in Washington, D.C., maybe slower in some ways, not exactly carbon pricing yet, at least. Curious about right now, the U.S. federally, how that is shifting, accelerating, driving, not driving, hindering what's happening subnationally.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, the obviously the shift in the executive branch is night and day, and so I think from a you know, all being on the same page with these goals and priorities, absolutely that's important. But I think it's also important to recognize that, you know, there's elected state and local leaders from the U.S. who've been driving this conversation for the last 4 years under the previous administration. The initiatives and laws that we pass on the state level is how we're going to implement, how we're actually going to get the policies that we need to act on climate. So there's this cry here from the activists who are marching outside, who want us to act on climate. That's why we called the bill that I passed in Rhode Island Act on Climate, because this needs to be more than words. We need to actually see policies that are going to be implemented to see the change that we need to see to actually hit these goals. States have been leading on that, and states will continue to lead on that. And that's why I'm so excited to be on panels with my colleagues from other states so we can talk about all the important action that's been happening on the state level, and also talk about how, in light of the science and all of those terrifying updates, how we can continue to be more aggressive and continue to you know, accelerate our action in light of that very dire need to do so.
Look, I can appreciate the remarks about the supranationals and the subnationals continuing to lead this conversation, because although none of us expected that 2016 would turn out the way it did, many of us didn't hold back in trying to achieve our ambitious climate goals and objectives. And I think we need to continue to think along those lines. Having a federal executive branch administration align with the work that's being done can only be complementary. And we're excited to see the strong emphasis being included in the infrastructure bill that was just passed by both houses, and so I'm sure will be signed soon, that focuses on the issue of transportation and building out our infrastructure with a clear roadmap on how we also create jobs up and down the nation, because I think that's critical, is the economic output that we're able to demonstrate to Americans that this is the right path to go, and that it is a sustainable one, not just from an environmental, but from an economic perspective.
I think ultimately, we all know we need a highly functioning federal government. We need public infrastructure, public investment. If we envision a future state years from today, we all talk about 2050, that we continue to grow our economy, but we do so with equity and environmental justice and sustainability and building design and elimination of hydrofluorocarbons and transit-oriented development and quality public infrastructure and walkability and smart growth and density and forestation and nature-based investments and agriculture and our relationship with food, decarbonization of the electricity system to integrate wind, hydro, solar, and other categories. We know that to have a future state where we can continue to build quality of life, continue to grow, but to do it with a tiny carbon footprint is the work of this era. We need a federal partner in that. But so much of the accountability is at the state level. As we decarbonize our electricity sector, our transportation sector, and all of these implications, it is impacted on the ground by states and cities and municipalities. So yes, we want a healthy, functioning federal government, and they have a checkbook, and it matters and it's important. But we also have a level of accountability and a level of connection to community that the federal government simply doesn't have. And I don't think that we can discount that. If we're going to envision a future state that is a net zero world, for us in Washington state, that means we currently emit about 100 million metric tons. By 2050, we have to grow our economy and we have to emit 5 million metric tons. So if you really let that sink in, and then you think about the global brands that are part of Washington state as an example, all the companies I mentioned, Boeing, Microsoft, Amazon, Costco, Starbucks, so many of them, for them to decarbonize their scope 3, for them to decarbonize global supply chain, shipping, aviation sector, all of these, it's not a federal government job to check some box. It's not passing a bill and a press release. It's deep systems work. And state and the private sector and civic society and civil society are the leaders. And that's the era that we're in. And so that's why I think COP has made this transition this year. It's all about solutions. People are talking, having coffee. They're talking on the bus. They're talking in the hallways about R&D and technology. They're talking about trading markets. They're talking about having a cap on emissions. They're talking about indigenous rights and the role of those investments. All of these issues, these are deep systems issues, and they're not a press release from Washington, D.C.
I mean, I think, you know, I think a lot of it's been said, you know, under the previous administration, we really saw U.S. states step up with leaders like the leaders we have sitting up here today. And I think that leadership is still just as important. I mean, now we have an ally in Washington, D.C., and we have allies in Congress. But, you know, we also have a much more ambitious NDC now. We have an NDC now. And so, you know, we need all of these states to continue to step up and to continue to push the envelope forward. And, you know, the best way to guarantee that we meet that NDC are these limits on pollution, you know, the transportation limit and the economy-wide limits and all of it. I mean, we need those in statute, and we're getting them at the state level, and that is going to be key to meeting our nationally determined contribution. So this work just gets more important as the day goes by, even with allies.
I think back to lawsuits. I laugh, but I, you know, cried at the time where IETA was the only business intervener, official intervener in the DOJ lawsuit with the linkage with California and Quebec. And it was, you know, that was not enjoyable. That was really problematic. Business, I mean, thankfully they had enough confidence in California in the market that they didn't run, you know, they were like, okay, we believe that you're okay, but still, that was awkward. So I point that more to the linkage with Quebec, the international linkage. Like there's so many different aspects to California and the WCI approach. that TCI is learning from, right? But it's transport, it's an actual international linkage where things like Article 6, how that's adopted, it matters. So I guess that my question to you is, you have already been around for a few days, longer than I have, at COP. What are going to be some of the key takeaways that you want to bring home to COP? And also, what are some of the biggest stories that you're sharing amongst the crowds here, be it corporates, other governments, other supranationals? Yeah.
Well, look, we, regardless of being California, the fifth largest economy in the world, I think there is so much to take away still from different parts of the world. I was intrigued and just motivated by the comments made by the Prime Minister of Barbados in the opening, conference kickoff, where she called us out. She said, "Look, we need to put our money where our mouth is, because some of us aren't going to be around much longer if we don't do that." And I think that that is so equivalent to the conversations back home, to the issue of equity, justice around climate, environmental justice, economic justice, and that we who are advanced in these efforts need to be mindful of that, and that there is so much more work to be done in that area. And so coming here with an open mind and an open heart to take away those types of messages and go back home that much more motivated to do the work that we do. Now, when we introduce ourselves and we say we're from California, people eyes open up and they want to know how we did, the program, and what are we doing to address the issue of environmental justice, and who's leading those conversations, and what are our benefits and investments looking like these days to turn around those circumstances. What is the process? I mean, clearly process is critical to this entire conversation in order to be inclusive, to design policy that is reflective of those needs. So we're excited to be here. We're excited to be with our colleagues from other parts of the United States, and certainly looking forward to going back home energized and ready to get to work.
That you're sharing, thank you, with people that you're meeting here, but also some of the major takeaways when you head back to Rhode Island.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this has been, just a great opportunity. So this is my first COP, and so I really think that this message of how the states have continued to push forward policy, I think, on an international stage, there's just a lot of skepticism, concern. Obviously, the last 4 years were a bit more than a hiccup. And so as the US is trying to, reestablish those partnerships and those conversations, it's been wonderful to kind of be able to be with a group of state legislators to be able to talk about how really the US has been able to push forward in really important ways. And I think that those are, we have a unique governance structure in some ways, in the ability of states to be able to push the conversation. And so I think that that's been really well received, and it's been led to a lot of interesting conversations. And I think, one of the things I love about coming together always is to figure out what those lessons learned. I mean, just speaking with my colleagues and, the different, we're all working on the same issues, right? It's we know what sectors we're working towards decarbonization. How do we get there? So how do we make sure that we are all working together to address this global problem, and really finding the local solutions that are going to work in each of our states, but also learn from each other, learn what's worked well, where those sticky conversations have come from. The level of discussion that I've had with folks about the environmental justice concerns, how to do genuine stakeholder engagement, bring people to the table in a way that is actually acknowledges and understands why there is skepticism. There's very real, justified distrust of many people having the conversation around environmental justice. How do we learn from that, and how do we listen to that and also move forward to have those conversations, build those coalitions, and truly be able to address those issues in our legislation moving forward in a real way that's accountable. To me, those are some of the conversations I've been most excited about.
It's right. There's a lot of hunger out there for those kinds of conversations to happen and some of the learnings. And COP, biggest takeaways, biggest stories that, well, you've been talking.
Well, one of the things that is so powerful is, we talked about solutions and the collaboration between all of us. I mean, there's thousands of state legislators. A handful of us are here as part of the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, where we coordinate. We're deeply focused on best practices. And that means both the relationship best practices to share, but also the science, the policy. So in the last 3 years in our state, we've passed 100% clean energy, the cap and invest bill, clean fuel standard, hydrofluorocarbons, commercial building standards, electrification of transportation. The decarbonization of each of these is more than just aspirational. So many of those ideas came from other states. So there might have been a legislator in a state who had a deep knowledge of hydrofluorocarbons, right? And California moved forward on adjusting the standards. Now that's an international movement relative to hydrofluorocarbons and superpollutants. It's almost a symbolic representation of that kind of coordination. The policy coordination, the relationship coordination, that's where it is all playing out in real life. So I'm excited to go back with a whole range of additional ideas. I'm crafting a pretty comprehensive policy on renewable hydrogen. Al Gore got up and talked about renewable hydrogen. California has gone down the path of experimenting with the automobile sector on that. That's been a little challenging. That wasn't as successful as they thought. We're focused, because of that experience, in part on the industrial sector, the maritime sector, the aviation sector, the energy storage sector, right? And using our hydro and our wind and our solar and maybe offshore and the lessons of Rhode Island and others on offshore as an opportunity for renewable hydrogen. So that's an example of deep systems work that is policy, business, financial, political, and relationship. So I'm going back with that kind of example. And what are some of the opportunities in renewable hydrogen for us as a region, as the entire Pacific Coast Collaborative, as an example of the kind of next generation of science and policy that also has business and investment opportunities worldwide.
Cooperative approaches. That's an Article 6 term. Pacific Coast Collaborative, actually, while we have you here. And what are some of the big announcements? And I maybe you're making a big announcements coming up, and I don't, but maybe there's a teaser if there's something that we should all be aware of. Is there anything related to carbon pricing?
So the Pacific Coast Collaborative, one of the big focal points right now is on the building sector. So trying to modernize the standards, and California and British Columbia has led on this. So sort of moving toward the circular economy, the circular integration of heating and cooling systems. Just the evidence-based best practices out of the Nordic countries is an important takeaway. So I think a lot of the Pacific Coast Collaborative is looking at the decarbonization of the building sector. Now that touches on the reality of natural gas. And the reality of natural gas in the West is it's an important element of reliability. And we have, with our wildfires and the lessons of Texas and Louisiana and wildfires in the West, we know, and the storms in the East, we know the magnitude of the importance of reliability. So how do we have a deep decarbonization strategy for natural gas that, whether it's hydrogen or other systems, embeds in an understanding of reliability? And the trading markets are going to deal with this in the industrial sector. So I think the Pacific Coast Collaborative is going to lead on this issue and really dive into what it looks like to move into that next generation of commercial building decarbonization.
Thank you. It's definitely a good club with shared grids, and there's yeah, and the teaser, I know that was kind of a sidebite. People in the audience, if there are any questions, feel free. Yeah, I'll come to you.
I'm Canadian. Okay, so, and I just wanted to say, I am really hopeful, even more so after sitting here today, and that subnational governments do have a huge role to play. I'm from Ontario. My daughter is the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit against our premier for weakening our climate targets. So, anyways, that brings me to my question. Youth. they don't, I don't, there's a missing piece here for them. If they knew more about how powerful the market or whatever this is, this leverage that we have with carbon pricing is, I think they'd be more hopeful. So I'm just wondering if you have any, and you've done an amazing job integrating so many communities, and I've listened very deeply. I'm just wondering what sort of thoughts you have about engaging youth. Thank you. And my daughter's very helpful because she loves carbon pricing. Okay.
I need to hang out with your daughter in Toronto. Thanks, Kathy. Great question. So youth.
Well, I guess it's a really good question because obviously, as we have seen from a lot of the activism and the protests, I mean, this is where so much of not even new energy, but maybe increasing energy is coming from. And I think there's an element of understanding that we need to make sure we're touching every single sector of our economy, and so that is an economy-wide program is a really essential strategy to get those reductions in every single place. The long list that Senator Carlyle listed of all the things we need to work on, and an economy-wide policy, therefore, is a really important place to have that backstop that Assemblymember Garcia mentioned. So I think it's maybe framing the question a little bit differently. I mean, we need to think economy wide. We need to have a firm enforceable limit. And in order to do that, we have a price on carbon. And, that price on carbon can help finance so many of the things these activists are looking for. We need investment across our economy, and this is a way to generate some of the revenue that we need to make those investments. So I guess it's a long-winded answer, but maybe think of it more as like this is a tool to meet the goals and the really ambitious action that they're calling on. And we're not just pricing carbon for the sake of pricing carbon. We're doing it so we can get the deep reductions as fast as we possibly can.
I agree with that. And I think too, part of it is, the younger generations are frustrated and angry and, justifiably so for a lot of reasons, not just climate. There are a whole slew of economics in the US in particular. But I think globally that our youth are very, very angry about, and I think it's justified anger. And I think part of genuinely being able to engage with any constituency who comes from a place of justified anger is to acknowledge and recognize that anger is justified, that we're hearing where they're coming from, and that we're trying to address it. And I think again, like in the environmental world, in the way that these economies have developed, is with creating externalities in the economic systems, and that externality is pollution and it's greenhouse gases. And so this is really almost a traditional way of trying to course correct for that what has historically been an externality in the market. So I think that understanding and then the education piece coupled together.
It's an excellent question. I think of history, and in every social movement, there's been a youth component pushing hard, pushing the envelope, right? And I think of the youth in my region of California, where the conversation happening there is about engagement, genuine engagement, consultation, and we're not talking about the global crisis in that context, but more so clean air, clean water, economic opportunities for poor people of color and our indigenous nations in our areas, and what are we doing to engage them sincerely to be able to incorporate those needs and put them front and center, and that's truly the process that young people are asking us to engage in right now as we're developing the scoping plan for our system in California. It's the environmental justice groups that are saying we want to be at the front of the line when having this conversation, and it's an environmental justice movement made up of young people, and it's exciting to see. For some policymakers, sometimes it's a It's a bit frustrating, but nevertheless, those are our constituents. And if this work is to directly benefit anyone, it's that youth and the 7 generations coming behind them that this work needs to be thought about when implementing these public policies. So I'm excited. You know, I once was a young 26-year-old elected official, and wanted to revolutionize and change the world in my local government. Now we have young 26-year-olds saying, "Hey, let's go. We need to move faster, and we need to act now because time is of the essence."
On the level of youth engagement or support for, yeah. Are there any other questions?
Hello, this may be a question for California. You hear me? So we develop a technology that works for reduced methane in farms. And the technology is already approved by the ACR, by the CDFA, by most of the entities. And the farmers really like, because not only we reduce more methane on the farms in the dairies, but only we clean the water that you mentioned is a main need in California. But we cannot compete with the program from digesters. Digesters have done a huge lobby, and right now farmers say, "I really like what you do. It creates more benefits, but there is so much money coming from this digester project that I cannot say no," and that's frustrating. So how you plan to incentivize innovation that go more than traditional systems?
We do know is that this carbon pricing mechanism is what triggers, right, innovation and technology. I think the timing of introducing new technologies is now, as we are engaging into the development of our next phase of regulatory mechanisms through the scoping plan. And so I'm going to invite you to join us in that effort in California. And as a board member of the California Air Resources Board, I'm certainly very interested in following up on that conversation with you, because I think all things should be on the table moving forward, not just for California, but for our sister states throughout the nation that are watching us act.
You know, I would just jump in very quickly, because I think this question is really a symbolic representation of the question of neutrality, of technology neutrality. The power of cap and invest, the power of this instrument is that it creates the most economically efficient way to reduce emissions. And we have to be religiously passionate about neutrality. We cannot go down this pathway of having lobbyists have undue influence on a given technology at a given solution. Agriculture as a sector is so critical to our success. It's critical not just in terms of of methane specifically and other pollutants. It's critical to justice and farm workers and communities and quality of life and opportunities. And so it's everything. It's on the table. It's so essential. And also it's been a community where there's been a lot of resistance to any type of carbon pricing as a general statement. So I think your question touches something incredibly impactful and deep relative to the importance of the very purpose of this instrument. And that's why we got to get it right around this technology neutral question.
Good question. Can I follow up actually with an offsets question about Washington State? And I think you touched on it a little bit, but just a bit more detail on the parameters for the offsets program. Will they only be within Washington State, not outside of Washington State, or is that still being decided? And any project type priorities?
Absolutely. So, you know, offsets are an important part of a successful program. But again, I just want to stress all and any offsets are included in our cap. So there's no pressure relief valve above the cap that is going to lead to increased emissions. We have a couple of guiding principles, guidelines. It's about 92, 93% direct compliance, so 7-8%, 50 to 75% in-state initially. We're sort of playing around. We do have statutory language in there on it, but we also are sort of trying to have, again, a deep sense of servant leadership and gracious humility to really look at best practices and make sure that we can do some, if we need to do some adjustments in this area around percentages. I would say we have an extra level of offset authorization for our tribal partners. We have an additional 3% that is allowed. Tribal partners are incredibly important in our state, our federally recognized tribes. Their investments in riparian areas and forestation, the Colville Nation in Eastern Washington has been a benefit of the California program. We have coastal tribes, Quinault Nation, which is feeling the direct impact, and we need to move their village. We put money in it effectively to do that. The Lummi Nation up near the Canadian border has a whole issues associated with acidification and water. So we have a lot of nature-based investments that are basically in the front of the queue. That's what this is about. And of course, we're facing wildfires. So forest management practices are incredibly important. And there's two other small provisions around offsets that I'm incredibly proud of. And one is that we put in a very specific language that will also be fleshed out in the rulemaking. But the language is to ensure that small forest owners, 10, 20 acres, 50 acres, 100 acres of a family farm or forest is eligible for participation in the offset program, just the way the giant corporations are and public lands. Because we want to make sure that if you're a family and you've got 50 acres and the older generation passes on and the younger generation looks at that and says, we're sitting on a couple of $1 million of timber, let's cut it down, that you can actually directly participate as an offset program on this. So we put in language on that. And then one other provision that we put in that I'm super proud of, it's one of those 3 a.m. ideas. I popped out of bed and scribbled this out. But I heard it from our tribal elders, and that was, I created a special fund of a couple $1 million and a backdoor way for the tribes to pick up the phone and call the state and say, we've got this idea, we need some technical support, financial advice, technical resources and operational resources. Can somebody do an analysis of this riparian area or of this water quality project or this lake repair or some type of project to see if it's eligible for offsets? So I listened deeply to our tribal elders and leaders who said, we need technical support and to make sure that we're able to take advantage of these programs. And that was a lesson that I learned also from our tribal friends in California.
That's fantastic. I didn't even realize that. And I mean, I know, Katelyn, you've been tracking it super closely, but those are some of those really unique things that we haven't seen elsewhere. Again, that probably California is watching a bit. Is there anything else you want to elaborate on or any?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is one of those great examples of where Washington sort of looked at what California had done and what had worked really well with respect to the offset program and where it's been really successful, and also where Washington can sort of go the next step to really, make sure there's a specific pot available basically for tribal offsets. And I think that's a really exciting step forward. Washington has some great provisions around ensuring, I think you spoke a little bit about this a few minutes ago, about ensuring that local criteria pollutants are also decreasing, including some levers to make sure that criteria pollutants are decreasing alongside greenhouse gas emissions at the facility level and in specific communities. And so I think that's a really important step forward. Washington has also created a standing environmental justice council to advise on the implementation of the program throughout. And, I think that's the type of thing that can really make a difference. So your environmental justice leaders can really engage in every step of the process and really learn the details of the program. And I think that's something that's hugely important as well. And I think a step, building on the advisory committee that California convenes to update our scoping plan, they said, okay, but we're going to do it and have it be a permanent standing committee. And I think there's a lot of good examples of where Washington saw what worked in California and said, let's go one step further and let's see how that will work. So.
I appreciate you saying that, and I so appreciate the leadership of California. I want to come back to one concept for a second. Offsets are one of the central concerns and criticisms and critiques of cap and invest program. And one of the most dramatic moments politically of the passage of this after years of work on this is I stood up before my colleagues in the Washington State Senate and I listed out and I showed the criticisms of the offset issues, the investigation reports from ProPublica and other news organizations, the newspaper stories, the criticisms, the critiques. And I put those out there and I said, these are the concerns. And here's the language that we've built to try to be authentic about addressing those concerns. Doesn't mean we have the answer, but we're showing up with some humility to say, okay, their criticisms may have legitimacy. Let's dive deep. Let's put the science on the table. Let's explore. And then fundamentally, we made the commitment that said all offsets are still within the cap. So they're not, again, they're not a pressure relief valve. So building environmental justice into the DNA of this work, making sure that any offsets are included in the cap, making sure that there's a sense of humility about the data and that we're not double counting, things like that. That's how we just showed up with intentionality on the issue of offsets. Instead of hiding, instead of being defensive, instead of saying that people were wrong, we said, bring it on, because this is about science, this is about climate change. I got 4 kids. And they said one thing on this. They said, I want you, Pop, to leave it all on the field for climate. And that's why we took this effort and to tackle those issues.
All right, we got 2 over here. So
thank you very much. I'm Andrea Tuttle. I've been involved with the forest offsets in California, the compliance one, since before they were even dreamed up. I was director of forestry at the time, and then so I know the evolution of the California standards. My question is, when you say that all your offsets are within the cap, does that mean that you have a cap on forests if you're considering forest offsets? Because that was always the hardest part, is how do you cap sectors that are hard to put a cap on? Agriculture, forestry, livestock.
What I mean is our aggregate cap to meet science-based targets between 2021 and 2050. We have an aggregate evolving lowering cap, and obviously allowances will be auctioned off. The cap is not separate to the sector of forestry. The cap is economy-wide. So our 130 largest emitters who emit 25,000 metric tons per year have to make choices. We all know that forestry is one of the best return on investments. That's the lesson worldwide. And so the question really will become, how do we invest in forestry in a way that uses sustainability? And so it's the investment side for forestry is the primary benefit. In terms of ensuring that offsets are used wisely, it's really about the integrity of the offsets, making sure that we're quantifying it accurately, making sure that those criticisms from some of those investigative reports and the learning from the California Air Resource Board and our friends in Quebec, because Washington and Quebec are very similar. So it's not sector specific relative to a specific cap, it's the overall program structure.
No, we're just chatting up here.
Okay.
You can go right ahead.
Is this on? Yeah, I guess. I'm State Senator Mike Barrett from Massachusetts, and good to see some old friends here. Had dinner with Senator Euer last night. Hi, good to see you. In Massachusetts, I want to switch the conversation away from the West Coast just a little bit to TCI, which is in terrible trouble. It's a cap and trade program that effectively has collapsed as a proposal at the moment. Senator Euer and I were talking about it. We started with 12 states and over the course of 3 years scaled down to 3, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And then Rhode Island and Connecticut couldn't go forward. And so at the moment, Massachusetts, which originated the idea, is all by its onesie. So cap and trade on a regional basis can run into trouble. The concept can, of course, fail to sell because the conservatives are representing it as a net increase on the price of, let's say, gasoline. TCI is specifically focused on transportation. It goes beyond electric power. An alternative that hasn't been discussed so far this morning is not cap and invest, but cap and dividend, where all the money in any form of carbon pricing program really does get rebated. So there are no investments, but on the other hand, politically, it can be more palatable for young people and for others. So isn't it important to keep in the mix the possibility of cap and rebate and basically returning to middle class and working class families the monies they've paid? It won't get returned. They won't reconsume gasoline. They'll probably spend it on food or clothing or entertainment. But I'm just want to make sure that we're preserving the option of rebating the money back in order to secure political approval, because in the East, TCI has essentially been deserted by governors, both Democratic and Republican, who are apparently afraid of the consequences for inflation and for rising energy prices.
So let me start. It sounds like there's sort of two pieces here. One is TCI and one is this idea of cap and dividend. And, to the point about cap and dividend, I think from, an environmental perspective, the most important part is the cap, is that firm declining limit on emissions. And then state by state, local needs, local politics, local priorities can determine what then happens to the revenue. So from my perspective, you can use those investments to drive further reductions, but you can also use them for individual households to invest as they choose. And I guess I don't necessarily see, a huge drawback one way or the other. I think it really is a local decision how best to use that revenue, as long as you have that firm declining cap on emissions that has integrity. I think that's really the most important part. So if cap and dividend is the way to go in Massachusetts, by all means, let's do it. And then with respect to TCI, it isn't evolving quite as fast as we had hoped, but I think we are seeing a good model on paper. I think there's still interest in a lot of states in moving forward. I think there's a wide recognition across the region that transportation emissions are a huge part of the problem. And I mean, Senator Euer was talking about, how the transportation emissions don't just stay in one state. I grew up in New England, so I'm very familiar with that drive down the 95 corridor. And, addressing transportation in a regional way makes a lot of sense. And it's worth taking the time to get it right for each state at the same time. So.
No, you use the microphone, I'm saying.
Too. Addressing things in a regional way for New England is proven enormously problematical. Maine just voted down a transmission line that would have brought clean electric power from Quebec to Massachusetts. TCI, my state is refusing to get tough on transportation because as a political dodge, our Republican governor wouldn't move unless there was a regional consensus. In other words, he wanted to be sure that he wasn't leading. He wanted to be in a group moving forward, which means the most conservative member of the group effectively had veto power. So what about the possibility that regionalism can be a refuge for states who don't want to lead? Of course, we need to address transportation, but that's another issue. There are all kinds of ways to do it: electric vehicles, electric mass transit. So I'm just raising the possibility that regionalism in an increasingly diverse and polarized United States could be as much a trap as a solution.
Let me give an initial thought, and then I'll pass it over to Senator Euer. I think, of course, there's a risk for that, and it's not unique to the Northeast or to transportation. We see it here at COP. We all have to work together, and working together can either mean you hide behind your sort of least ambitious player, or it means that everybody gets peer pressured to increase their ambition. And so it's not easy, certainly, but I think it's really important. No one state can solve this problem on its own. And so I think it's really important to keep that pressure on and keep moving forward. And if Massachusetts isn't going to move right now, maybe in a couple of years Massachusetts will move, and it will have other states to follow the lead. Maybe it's Rhode Island, maybe it's Connecticut, but I think together we can do more. It is hard, though. There is no doubt about it, and you know that better than most.
This is one of those things where it's an either or situation. I think it's a yes and situation. And I'll use Reggie as the example, right? So Rhode Island was part of Reggie. We also lead in the energy sector. We were the first domestic offshore wind turbines in the ground in the country. That wasn't something that we had to do because of Reggie. It was certainly helped because of Reggie, but we led on that issue, and are part of the Reggie coalition. I think that TCI is part of the solution in the transportation sector. I know that our new governor in Rhode Island has been sending representatives from our Department of Environmental Management, has still been participating in the conversations, and we've also passed the TCI bill, has made it through the Rhode Island Senate, and we'll be back at it for the next session. I know similarly Connecticut is being, the leadership in Connecticut who are working on their bill are being very aggressive to make sure that their commitment to stay in the TCI compact stays true and moves forward. So I don't think that it is, I don't think it's an either or, but at the same time, I'm not going to sit here and hold my breath waiting for the regional compact details to be codified and hammered out. I also am looking at this infrastructure bill and the funding that's coming down from the feds and thinking about how am I going to be addressing our state budget and transportation spending? Because by the way, if we take all of the money that we're getting from the feds and spend it on expanding freeways, electric vehicles or not, we're going to continue to double down on our climate problems. So we need to be wise about how we're doing state spending and state dollars as we move forward on the transportation issue, just to focus on that sector. So that's how in our state in Rhode Island, we're going to be aggressive on a state level, while also, my colleague, Senator Ilana DiMario, she's championed the TCI bill. And so, she's been very wonderful to work with on this. I'm the chair of the committee that the bill is in. She's the lead sponsor of the bill, and we work in partnership on these issues.
Great discussion. And we're going to wrap really soon, but I want to make sure, are there any others in the audience who had a question? All right. So I have one final one. It's kind of a random one, but trust me, carbon pricing, border carbon adjustments. Back in the day, California was talking about a border carbon adjustment for cement, like several years back. And it was the first time there were any even whispers of these programs, including in the EU, which now we do have a proposal for their CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism. So quickly, like there are major links between carbon pricing, that level of ambition, and border carbon adjustments, and being a part of a club or being excluded and having your exports dinged at the border. That's a really simplified version, but there's still a lot of questions. California, is it going to come back for discussion within the scoping plan or pilots?
We've seen some legislators bring back that discussion, and looking at it from the perspective of what are the economics around that? Can we create an economic opportunity within California for these goods and products? We do have a number of colleagues that don't want to go there and have this conversation. And so it will be very interesting to see how many of my colleagues that are here with me today, both from the Senate and the Assembly, go back and begin to drum this discussion further. So I anticipate that it will be a discussion that makes it to a place where it will be seriously considered. I don't doubt it. I can think of two colleagues that are here that are watching right now that are saying, yeah, that's the conversation we want to have, then we need to have. So thank you for asking.
At the very least, you want to make sure that Washington, D.C., or in my case, in Ottawa in Canada, they're consulting on border carbon adjustments right now. And you better believe that they want to make sure that their provinces who have their carbon pricing systems are right at the table and they're coordinated in lockstep. Any final comments before we wrap the session?
Well, first of all, it's obviously just an incredible honor for all of us to be here, and I just really want to emphasize how the broad themes of COP this year is just all about solutions. It's all about moving into action, and that's why it's so exciting for us to share the stories of our individual states. You know, obviously we know the magnitude of California as a market, but when you start to add the Western region, the Pacific Coast, when you start to add Quebec, when you start to sort of look at what's really possible at the state level, it's very powerful. And I think for young people, it's inspirational to know that action is possible. We're small enough to be to get things done and big enough to be impactful. And that's why states are the laboratories of democracy and actually matter a great deal. So it's exciting to be part of it all for all of us. But I know that the many state legislators, a handful of state legislators who are here are playing an outsized role in telling the story, because this type of action is what people are hungry for.
That's why I've rewired my brain. Now I say supranationals. Supranationals. So with that, thank you very much, NECL, EDF, for being my co-host, the IETA co-host. Thank you so much. And obviously our incredible speakers. So Sullivan, Garcia, and we have Senator Euer, and we have, of course, Senator Carlyle. So thanks. Give them a round of applause, please. And enjoy the rest of your COP.